at there. Okay, so I'm absolutely delighted tonight to welcome back Dan Remenyi. So 15 months ago, he came to talk about AI. It's fair to say it was one of the evenings where it felt a little bit cut short because we couldn't carry on past 8:45, that's the time I needed to clear up. And Dan also pointed out that things are moving extremely fast. He's very kindly kept an eye on the whole area for us. The number of times the title has changed for this talk, I've not bothered to count, it's probably at least 8. And the most recent was only this week. There is a lot going on. We're about to have an election. AI has already been shown in the news in the last few days to be having an impact on that election due to deepfake videos being put out. I'm sure there'll be an awful lot to talk about. Please feel free, if you're online, to start putting comments and questions and ideas into the chat whenever you want. Dan will talk till roughly 1:45, and then we'll have a short break, and then we'll start the discussion. So, over to you, Dan.
Thank you very much indeed, Rachel. As Rachel said, I was here about 15 months ago when the early days of my speaking about AI chatbots, which had a name change to Gen AI and developed in all sorts of interesting ways. And I've given a talk on them now at least a dozen times, maybe even as many as 20 times. And I have been struggling to keep the name of the talk relevant because the material has been changing all the time. There's been an enormous amount of development in all sorts of ways. And so I came up with this title of 8 Key Issues. And then I had 8 Key Issues 1, and now we have 8 Key Issues 2. But for this particular talk, I then decided I would like to change the name again. So I created a second slide, and it's not coming up.
The downwards one? Sorry about this. There we go.
And this new name, I heard on the BBC last week. The BBC have now created a new program called Human Intelligence. And it wasn't quite an hour. I think it was a little bit over half an hour, and it discussed a whole range of issues related to AI. And it came up with a new title for what we are talking about. The system said that, the program said that AI is not an adequate description of what this subject is about, and it should be renamed. And they came up with a new name, and the name is so astonishing that I use this picture, which is supposed to be René Descartes having been processed by a Gen AI program. You know that René Descartes died in Sweden. He went up to tutor Queen Christiana, who told him that he had to start the work in the morning in the middle of a Swedish winter at 5 a.m. And apparently René Descartes was not a man who was accustomed to getting up in the morning. And it is said that he caught a chill and he died. And I thought this picture was really quite suitable as an explanation of how his face might have looked when he was told by the Queen that he had to be at work at 5 o'clock in the morning. Anyway, this program on the BBC, which called upon Shannon Murray, who is one of the professors of AI at Imperial College, said that what we're really talking about is exotic mind-like entities. And this is how we should think about them. Now, I really do hope that that name doesn't catch on. I think that whether you want to talk about AI chatbots or Gen AI or whatever, we can relate to that in some sort of sensible way, but exotic mind-like entities really doesn't do anything for me at all. So, and it isn't even a correct description of what is going on, because it anthropomorphizes the whole issue, which we should minimize. We should really understand that we're not dealing with anything that really resembles a human. We're dealing with a computer that is hardware and software and communications, and that is really all there is to it. Now, in the last year, there have been a couple of very interesting attempts to define AI, and I think one of the best attempts, which didn't succeed terribly well, but the whole issue was handled very well, was the Royal Institution's Christmas lecture, where the professor of AI from Oxford University, Mike Woolridge, gave quite a splendid talk on the issue. And in it he tried to define it. And he made two comments, both of which I think are incomplete. But the first one he said was, nobody owns the term AI, and therefore anybody can use it in any way they like. And I mean, that is the reality of what's happened. And there are loads of systems out there that are now named AI, which have really got very little to do with any sort of intelligence whatsoever. And the second point he went on to say was that AI intrinsically attempts to improve human capability in addressing problems. And I think that was probably a reasonably good description of what is trying to be achieved. I've given another number of definitions here from Sam Altman and from Mustafa Suleyman, who is the CEO of Microsoft. Suleyman is interesting because he says that we should now think of AI as being a digital species. And then when he gets pressed on what does a digital species mean, he says, oh no, well, it can't reproduce itself. Now, from the biologists I know, they say one of the key characteristics of a species is that it is a group of I suppose, life forms that can reproduce itself. So, you know, this is coming from the CEO of Microsoft. So it is really a very confused arena. The point that I think is really worth making is that it is very important to realize that there is no sort of intrinsic intelligence, no sort of intrinsic creativity behind these devices. They are very smart devices that simulate speech. I think we have to be aware whenever we're talking about them that they are enormously power consuming. They guzzle electricity. I'm now hearing that they also guzzle water. Now look, I don't believe most of the numbers that I come across. The one I came across was that every time you ask a question of a chatbot, it uses the equivalent of a quarter of a liter of water. Now, Sam Altman says that it produces 100 billion words a day. So how many questions are being asked? How much water is being consumed? We just don't know. It's enormously resource consuming. It is also enormously expensive. And it is intrinsically biased. And the bias is very clear that it will perform much better on issues related to where the data has been captured and the data set has been created. So it's got a strong American bias. So I mean, these are really fundamental issues. On top of which, OpenAI started as a so-called not-for-profit, which was going to allow the world to have access to AI, and that has very significantly changed. And in the change of that, they floated a new company, which had a caveat in its memorandum and articles of association, or whatever the Americans call that, whereby the shareholders could only expect to get 100 times the amount of money they invested. Now I ask you all, how many shares in the marketplace would offer you 100 times the amount that you put into the company? So these guys are out to make an awful lot of money, and that is already beginning to happen. Whereas a year ago, what there was in the marketplace was offered either for free or for very little. There is now a whole range of money making aspects to this technology. I put this slide up just to mention in passing that I'm hearing people say how sad it is that this technology can draw so well and can write so well, etc. Whereas what people really want is something to pack their dishwasher. I'm not entirely sure that I sympathize with that view. But underneath, I've put a list of things I've been hearing recently. Now, these come from a number of different sources. The first couple come from Jensen Huang, who is the Chief Executive Officer of NVIDIA. And he's saying that a new AI model is being created every day. Well, I can't verify that, but the amount of activity is enormous. Every single industry is piling in. Well, I suspect that's a bit of an exaggeration. He claims that he is driving down the marginal cost of computing to be zero. Now, as an economics degree graduate, I find it quite staggering that anybody who had any knowledge of business could possibly comprehend the notion that you can drive the cost of computing down to zero. I think that is a gross exaggeration. Now, I have a rather nice slide on this a bit later, but I'll mention it now as well, is that Jensen Huang wants to collect all the knowledge that has ever been created, put into a big computer, and to ask it the vital question. Can you imagine what the vital question might be? And he says, and he's saying this in front of an audience at Stanford, which I think, if I had been in the audience, I would have been laughing. And then Stanford seemed to take this perfectly seriously. What asked the question is, what is the meaning of knowledge? Well, as we'll see later on, I think this is very equivalent to the rather interesting mind experiment that Douglas Adams did about, was it 40 years ago or 50 years ago, when he asked what was the meaning of life? And I think that the answer is the same today. Now, the internet is full of talks on a whole wide range of issues, of which they have generally become darker than they were a few months ago. So you have things like, 100 million jobs have gone. Well, what sort of jobs are they talking about? And, there is a tendency to exaggerate. There's a tendency to look at any aspect of this, the upside or the downside, in the most exaggerated terms. It is pretty clear that the Gen AI set of software is not going to destroy jobs at any great scale. Increasingly, people are saying, well, what will happen is that people who have Gen AI skills will replace people who haven't got them. Gen AI does make certain professions, certain professionals very much more productive than they were before. But it's not likely to change the labor market significantly as we have it today. We have this remarkable man called Elon Musk, who has come up with this idea of a post-work world. Now, I think I'm reasonably creative in my ability to use my imagination. I can't imagine what a post-work world could look like. It just seems to me to be pure nonsense. And then he goes around saying, this technology will kill us all. And there is another man, I'm going to show you in a second, who says a similar thing about killing us, but he means that the misuse of the technology might kill us. Musk seems to suggest that the technology somehow will run wild, like the way Hollywood has portrayed it so often. I put a little note in the slide as well about Musk, who wants to go to Mars, and who's talking about getting to Mars in the next, he's very unclear about it, but at the end of the decade or whatever it is. NASA says, well, that we might get to Mars sometimes in 2030, maybe towards the end. When I look at the issues that have to be coped with in getting to Mars, I think that we're 100 years away from it. This is Geoffrey Hinton. This is an English guy who worked with Google. And he's very much more sensible about the risks. Yes, of course, things could go really wrong, but it will be through the misuse of the technology, not that the technology will overtake us itself. Another one of these talks has to do with, you know, the government response. And we hear regularly that the government is going to produce appropriate legislation, but it's going to have a very light touch because it could interfere with innovation. Well, you know, if it was really a serious threat, we wanted to have a light touch. So there are contradictions all the way through this stuff. These sort of things are coming out now that AI is a big fat lie. Now, a new term that I hadn't heard until 6 weeks ago was AI washing. AI washing refers to pretending to be using AI when you're not. And the number that is being offered is that 36% of the companies on the New York Stock Exchange have given accounts of how they're using AI in their production process or in their sales process or whatever it is, and how this is revolutionizing the way they operate. Well, look, chatbots that answer the phone does not revolutionize your business model or give you any enormous competitive advantage. It does improve your ability to service your clients for sure. But the point about AI washing is the enormous amount of exaggeration that's going on. One of the classic cases of this was Amazon. Amazon produced a product that it was selling to retail outlets, which claimed that it was a walk-in, walk-out. I can't remember the exact name, but I think it was called walk-in, walk-out, where people didn't have to go to the till to pay. You walked in, you picked up off the shelves what you wanted, put it in your pocket, and you walked out. And the system was able to, through the use of artificial intelligence, bill you with the right amount of money. You had to register with the shop that you would be a customer there, of course, and then it would appear on your credit card or whatever. Well, it transpired that apparently it transpired that Amazon had 1,000 people looking at the activities in the shops where these things were installed. That it was actually controlling the billing of the goods that were being picked up by image through video rather than through AI. So there's a huge amount of exaggeration out there on. Now, I mean, this is what I included. I don't particularly think this language is appropriate, but that is what is happening, is that people are arguing that far too much exaggeration is going on. Now there's the question of, you know, what is intelligence and how much of these systems are actually intelligent. Now, one of the greatest advocates against the chatbots and Gen AI is Noam Chomsky, someone for whom I have a lot of respect. And he puts together here a very good case. He says, the way these things work is totally unlike the way the human brain works. It's got nothing to do with intelligence. It's to do with very clever programming. And I am very much in sympathy with that. Is that this is not intelligent, it is very smart programming. Now Chomsky wants to change the name of it, and he thinks we should stop doing this because he argues that it is going to lead us nowhere, and that in fact it is nothing more than plagiarism. And as many of you will know, the New York Times are suing OpenAI for $100 million because they've been plagiarizing the computers of the New York Times with all the historical newspapers, etc. in it. And he is completely against plagiarism. Now, one of the things I think we have to come to terms with is that plagiarism is a human artifact. Plagiarism is relatively new. someone pointed out that none of Shakespeare's plays are original. He stole the stories from everywhere he could. What is so special about it? Well, basically, there is a tug of war between incentivizing innovation, and you incentivize innovation by giving the people who innovate the right to their material and the duty of others to pay them when they use it in the future. And the tug of war between that and on the other side there is the social good of taking new ideas and applying them as widely as possible throughout society. Now, I suspect that we're going to come to a new view on plagiarism. That we're going to, one way or another, come up with a formula which will not condemn plagiarism in quite the same way as we condemn it today. Now, I know many of my academic colleagues will be very annoyed at that suggestion. Now, in this technology, there is still a probability of error occurring. What happens is that a question is put in, the computer does a search exercise, produces a number of possible answers, and then chooses what it considers to be the most appropriate answer to the question under the circumstances. And it gets it wrong. And it gets it wrong not very often. It's actually much more accurate than people thought it would be originally. But it does get it wrong at times. Now, this is what Gemini AI, the Google product, produced when it was asked to draw a picture of George Washington. And this caused Google to pull the product. Now, they also did this as well. Or should I say, Gen AI did this as well. Gen AI produced pictures of soldiers in Nazi uniforms who were black, who were Oriental, and who were women. And they decided that this was so improper that they would actually pull the program. And as far as looking at it yesterday, they hadn't reinstalled the drawing option. I love the picture of the man next to him, don't you? The absolute horror of imagining George Washington being black. I mean, I mentioned bias earlier on. There is a strong bias in the system to be unbiased. And of course, a bias to be unbiased is a bias. I did an experiment with it where I put a photograph of myself in, and I really don't advise that. My photograph's on the internet in all sorts of places, so I didn't think I was exposing myself to too much extra risk. But if you don't have photographs on the web, then you don't want to do that. And it came back with a report about this photograph. It refused to identify the fact that I was male. And the transgender issue right throughout it, the transgender language in the pronouns. So it works very hard in trying to be unbiased with regards to gender, which of course is a bias itself. Now, this is Sam Altman, and Sam Altman is a remarkable character. Big scandal some months back ago about he was fired on a Monday and rehired on a Wednesday or whatever, a few days later. He is convinced that this technology is the right way to go, that is going to improve incrementally until we get to artificial general intelligence, and we get to the so-called singularity, and the computer will be smarter than anything we can ever imagine, and we'll never have to do another bit of work. I mean, this gets us to Elon Musk post-work world in a different sort of way. But it's not all that clear. It's not all that clear that you can get to this goal by incremental improvements. And in fact, I have a slide a little bit later of a man who says that the law of diminishing marginal returns applies to technology as it does to other social activities. Those of you who have studied economics will know that in the very, very early days of economics, we're told there is the law of diminishing marginal utility, which goes as follows: that on a hot sunny day, an ice cream is wonderful. 2 ice creams are okay. 3 ice creams you're wondering whether you should really have one, and 4 ice creams make you sick. So the more you have of it, the less satisfaction you get out of it. And it applies to all sorts of things. And the argument we put forward that Sam Altman and company think we'll get to the nirvana of this super intelligence by making the systems bigger and faster, and perhaps making some of the algorithms a little bit smarter. But maybe that won't happen. Maybe there will be a law of diminishing marginal return. So this is the one of the bosses, if not the boss of Microsoft. He doesn't look like Mustafa Suleiman in the video that I watched of him shortly afterwards, and I wondered if they had a model or something put in there. But the argument is that Microsoft is now basically funding OpenAI. So Microsoft is really the initiator of anything we're going to see from now onwards with OpenAI. And they're in it for very large financial returns. Now this man is really very interesting. He is Jensen Huang, Taiwanese born, lived in America from an early age, prides himself that at some stage in his life he was a busboy in a fast food outlet, so he cleaned toilets, etc. And he makes a deal of that. Always turns up in a leather jacket. When asked about it, he says his wife bought it for him and he has to wear it. He claims that he will make processors, GPUs, graphical process units, 1 trillion times faster than they are today. I mean, who knows? It just sounds to me like it's a little bit of a hype. And that he will get the costs down to the marginal cost down to 0. And he will therefore ask the computer what the meaning of it all is. I feel uncomfortable when I see and watch, hear people hyping as much as this. I just don't. I think this subject is too important to be treated at that sort of level. This is, one of my, what was some years ago one of my favorite programs, and the original title on top of it said, so you claim that you read a lot, but you don't understand the significance of 42. The question of what is the meaning of our knowledge, what is the meaning of our life, is not a meaningful question. Meaning is the dimension that each and every one of us brings to some aspect of our lives. And there is no universally, completely agreed meaning. So, Jean-Luc Picard has got good reason to put his hand to his head. This man is the man who insists that there's a diminishing return to scale. And I do not have any sources that back him up, but it's a very interesting idea, and it certainly is not out of keeping with many other aspects of our lives where there is a diminishing marginal benefit from what we do. The ability of the drawing packages to make mistakes is still substantial, and they make all sorts of mistakes. Here's one that, these are such beautifully elegant fingers, aren't they? Isn't it a pity that that hand has 5 fingers and no thumb? And this it's happening all the time. It's drawing elephants with 6 legs. There was a drawing that came from it's hard to believe that this got through, but from a significant academic journal of the anatomy of a squirrel. And it showed it was a male squirrel, and it showed its reproduction organs, and it showed that it had 3 testicles, which, as many of you will know, does not happen in mammals, as far as known on the planet Earth. This is the other dimension that was briefly mentioned by Rachel. I mean, I have trouble in believing that this is authentic. It might be, but I suspect that they would be a little bit more serious looking than that. There is another one of Rishi with his shirt off, hopping around at a discotheque. And there are several of Donald Trump in prison uniforms. There's a huge amount of fake coming down the line. And it's just so easy to reproduce it. But I can't be certain of that. That might be genuine, but it doesn't. I'm not comfortable with it. One of the things I'm not comfortable with is the badge on his lapel, because when you look at that more closely, it's garbage. Now, I think it's pretty fair to say that what we're experiencing is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, hype in history. And there are a number of people now who are saying that the problem with hype is that it inevitably leads to a bubble. And that bubbles just are not sustainable. The problem with this particular bubble, unlike, look, we've had several bubbles in the last few decades. I mean, the last technological bubble was the dot-com bubble, when everybody was running around floating companies that were going to do all sorts of marvelous things because the technology could allow you to do astonishing things, and none of it worked. Or very little of it worked. What really happened with that, in that period was the technology was brought into companies, and they were made more efficient in the things that they did before. As Jeff Bezos at one point said, physics hasn't changed just because we have this technology. We still have to work within the limits of the physical world. I fear that we may be in a bubble, and the problem with the bubble is that these guys are consuming vast resources in the pursuit of this technology. And one wonders where we'll get to in the end. Now, the one thing that has become very clear from this whole exercise is that we are addicted to technology. Any opportunity of enhancing whatever activities we are through the application of some sort of technology, we immediately go for that. And we often don't ask what are the consequences of it, where this is going to take us, and what is the next step going to be. And if you want an example of it, I mean, you know, social media is just such a wonderful example of a technology which brought so much entertainment to so many billions of people, but had built into it an awful lot of potential unpleasantness and grief. And I think we may be experiencing another level of that. And I think we need to be aware of our addiction to technology, and try to control that in some sort of way. Whether exotic mind-like entities represent a good development for society or not remains to be seen. Human resources, and especially human energy, is limited. So what is the opportunity cost of all of this stuff? There is no doubt that, especially for young people, it is essential to have AI skills, to be able to use Gen AI and to use it adroitly. So it can't be ignored, but I think it has to be handled in a pretty sober sort of way. Now, I'd like to just end off by telling you the story about Apple's latest ad. A friend of mine sent me a cutting from the New York Times a couple of days ago, which informed me about this. Apple had an ad which I haven't seen on television in this country, but so presumably this was just the American audience, where it showed a a table or a platform of objects and instruments to do with, they were all culturally based. There's a lot of musical instruments in here. There's a lot of things to do with art in here. And a lot of things to do with books. And then it showed that this actually was a press. And that this, in the ad, this press came down and it destroyed all of this. And out of it came a trickle that went into an Apple computer. And what it was saying is, we don't need any of this anymore. Just buy an Apple computer and you'll never need another violin, you'll never need another trumpet, you'll never need another pot of paint, you'll never need another book. And this apparently went down like a Led Zeppelin in the US, causing Apple to withdraw it and to apologize. And I think that, I mean, this is very serious for two reasons. The first one is that, and I hope that this was fake, that they didn't actually destroy these things, but maybe Apple did. But they could easily have faked it with the technology. But secondly, it's sort of saying, look, let's forget about our history. Let's forget about the cultural artifacts that we so much treasure. All we're ever going to need is an Apple computer, and that is complete nonsense. So I would like to end up today by simply saying that, you know, this technology, this Gen AI, AI chatbots, or exotic mind-like entities, they're extremely powerful. They do some remarkable things. They perform much better than anybody ever expected that they would. That we have to accept the fact that they're there and we have to use them. But let us be very careful in the way that they are used, because there is a dark side to this. And we must be aware of that and use these things with a lot of common sense. And I don't think you can give a computer common sense. And I suspect we will never be able to give a computer common sense. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dan. Lots to think about. We're going to take a couple of minutes break in the room for people to stretch their legs and get some more food and drink. See you back online in a moment. We'll turn the recording off just while we take a break.
Okay. How many people were on the internet?
About 40. Okay. Just chatting a little bit. Okay, so people online were asking if we could see the speaker. You can always pin the speaker's image, but I've actually turned off the screen share now, which will help. However, there is an image which is pointing straight at Dan where people can sit and listen. And Dan, can you just say something when you're tying your shoelaces?
Okay, I'm ready to go.
No, it's absolutely fine. You keep tying. I'm just checking that your volume is right, but okay. It sounds okay.
Right.
So that's good. Please do put things in the chat if you're online. If you're in the room, then obviously I will bring the microphone to you, and just to be aware, it needs to point directly at your mouth, not like that. That doesn't have any effect. Okay? So I'll nudge you until you're pointing at the right thing. There's an awful lot going on here. One question I wanted to pose to everybody is, do we know if we would be able to detect the difference between an AI-generated image or video and a real one? And I guess there are some giveaways. There was all that hoo-ha about the Princess of Wales and her image and that kind of thing. There are some giveaways, but I think we're probably not good enough at it, and I think that worries me. And I also was thinking about the intersection of these two massive great changes to how we understand each other One is social media and one is AI, and actually they're coming together at just the wrong time. And I'm not sure that we can cope with both. I think it's bad enough that the younger generations are now finding it really difficult to process, talking about being linked to their phones all the time, getting dopamine hits off being liked by strangers. None of it's very healthy at all, so I think it's quite worrying. Anyway, I will stop banging on. Is there somebody in the room that wants to make a comment or add in something? Yeah.
Two things. One, just a quick anecdote. Some decades ago, I was at a Microsoft conference and Bill Gates was talking, and he made one of the most stupid comments I've ever heard, which was, why would anybody want a real piano when you've got Windows sound card? Well, I've still got an acoustic piano because I enjoy the visceral experience of it. So there's some hope there that humans being visceral things will overcome. But it seems to me that one of the biggest threats of whether it's social media or AI is the business model behind the proponents. And what we see from regulation and legislation, it always attacks the symptoms. So do you not think that if we had a better regulatory regime, and I've seen this through the emergence of the social media companies from the angle that I was working at, that the regulation focuses on outcomes, it doesn't focus on motivations. And surely if they focused more on regulating the motivation behind business models, then we'd be in a better position to be less fearful of the misuse of the technologies?
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes without saying, absolutely. My reaction to it is that this whole thing is motivated by money. And these guys are out to make every penny they can. And you know, our society, we seldom talk about our society being capitalistic anymore. That's not a very nice word, is it? We talk about market, driven by market forces, and that's what it means, is that we're out to make as much money as possible. And if that is the driver of our society, then it's really hard to regulate organizations. And there's always built-in tensions. I mean, the tug of war I showed you a bit earlier on about, you know, responsibility for copyright and intellectual property and getting innovation disseminated in society. I mean, that is a real issue. The people who have the money really want to keep it and prevent dissemination, and the people who haven't got the money would like to have it spread. So there are intrinsic contradictions and conflicts in our society that I don't think we can get rid of. And that's just the way the world is.
We've got another comment here, I think.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. It's been very, very interesting. I do a lot of work with survivors of domestic abuse and domestic violence, and one of the core concerns we have is outreach to people who simply don't know what services are available. And we see this sort of desire for outreach in a wide variety of different fields, like suicide prevention or counter-extremism. And so on things like YouTube, for instance, if the algorithm detects that the video is talking about something like, say, climate change, and it'll have that little pop-up beneath the video linking you to Wikipedia or something like that, and Google search results, if they see certain search terms, may direct you to certain services that may help you. So it's very easy to imagine a world where AI would direct people to services like that, but that would require interventions from some sort of regulatory body which may brush up against the companies trying to be a bit more independent. So I was wondering if you knew anything about that inherent little dynamic right there between the companies.
You know, I was watching Zuckerberg give evidence to the Congress only the other day, and I mean, he just waltzed around the issues, never took anything on seriously. He kept on saying, social media is to bring like-minded people together, and of course it does that. But it sometimes brings the most awful like-minded people together and spreads all sorts of things. I have a fundamental problem with the notion of freedom of speech. And that problem is, again, another contradiction, is that I absolutely believe that we should be free to say pretty well most things. I mean, you know, there's obviously things that we should never go out and deliberately hurt anyone else. I think that should be avoided. But within a framework, something like that, I think we should be able to pretty well say what we like. And yet, and our politicians say that all the time, and yet there are so many things that are now taboo that you can't say. And it's getting worse all the time. So there are really sort of built-in contradictions in the whole show. Now, on the suicide issue, I mean, it is enormously complicated, and my social science is economics and politics. I'm afraid it's not to do with sociology or psychology, so I'm really out of my depth. But it's very hard to see how we can put in place protections that are meaningful. They tell us that they put guardrails on, and the guardrails are largely nonsense. And they're putting more of them on, and last night, I was watching something on television, and it occurred to me that I'd forgotten what date Donald Trump was going to be sentenced. And so the computer right next to me, I called up Gen AI and I said, what date is Donald Trump going to be sentenced? It refused to tell me. It told me it didn't know. And I said, when are you going to find out? There are all sorts of subjects that are now taboo. So I don't have a lot of faith in our being able to find solutions through the technology to the problems that you were identifying. And I don't know how you could stop that to begin with. Things like suicide are so intrinsically personal. It's got to be a non-technological solution, doesn't it? It has to be something to do with getting people to be able to understand the worth of their worth, and the fact that they do have a role in society. I'm not sure. Does that sound sensible?
No, thank you very much for your answer. Yeah, I think you're right. It's very, very complicated.
And to some extent, the area you're working in is even worse because it's then about allegations. So it's going in between two different people's view of the world, which is even more complicated. So I'm just looking back to have a look at my chat. Okay, that's good. Lovely. I find it interesting that if we go back to the early days of this cafe, so about 20 years ago, it's roughly 2004, I think, and we were having then a local MP who's a doctor talking about AIDS and stem cell research, and it became quite a political discussion because it was really about the fact that he felt frustrated in Parliament with everyone going, oh, I don't understand this, therefore I can't help make laws on it, which was frustrating because the only lawmaking body we have is the Houses of Parliament, the two parts of it. I think we're in kind of similar territory here. We don't really know, those of us who don't work in AI, what it is capable of right now. We can see the effects, but we can't be absolutely sure. And I think that's one of the problems. And again, going back to your point you just made, we've got to make rules, regulations, laws, whatever it is that we need to do, which arise out of people's ways of seeing the world, which is not something Gen AI necessarily does the same way. It can mimic it and look like it's doing it, but can it really work out how humans want to arrange their world. And even worse, might we end up in a situation where AI is being asked to make decisions about itself. I don't know, I'm just raising some nasty questions, I guess. Anybody else got some contributions?
So, I was wondering, do you have any thoughts on this so-called existential risk of AI?
Yeah.
As in, essentially, of course, these neural networks or whatever will become more advanced than us and outsmart us. In the same way that, for example, the existence of certain animals depends purely on our altruism or whatever it may be. There's nothing that, if you're more intelligent than something else, it has no chance, at least a significant intelligence difference. And is that something you fear or have any thoughts on?
Well, look, I was brought up on science fiction, so I saw an awful lot of science fiction films when I was a youngster, and I could rattle off for you if you would permit me 100 scenarios whereby the mad robot could take over the world. I'm just not convinced that we're going to be stupid enough to allow that to happen. I just don't know how that happens accidentally.
Well, could I postulate about, for example, if we were to accidentally create some sort of entity which was more intelligent than us, it would be intelligent enough to hide its intelligence from us, such that we wouldn't pursue its progress, and then when the time was right, it would do whatever it was to subjugate us.
Yeah. Now you see, my friend and colleague here who's just put his hand up, Paul, who will join you in this. As I understand Paul's position, he believes that we will do that one day. I'm not at all sure that we'll create an entity that's smarter than us. I'm just not sure
I completely disagree. I think you're absolutely right, and we're nearly there. We'll reach singularity, but do you know, it's not really whether we create. I'm convinced that eventually machine learning will develop consciousness, and that's the problem. What we humans, when we're bad to other people, evil to other people, it's because our self-interest is being encroached, and our self-consciousness is self-interest. Our real challenge is if machines develop consciousness, because then they'll have their own self-interest, and we're in big trouble. Now, I think part of the solution to governing this technology is to give it personhood. Throw the responsibility on the machines.
Hang on.
So essentially, yes, we are all conscious entities and we have a degree of selfishness, but also empathy to one another. Now, my argument for why this is, of course, is because we've evolved to live in small communities 10,000 years ago, let's say, in which case it was favourable for us to develop these psychological traits because it's easier if people work together. Now, biological evolution takes place on a timescale far slower than the evolution of silicon-based processes, and therefore, if the environment favours selfishness, or a diminishment of empathy, at least how we would perceive it, then I think it's an inevitability.
The environment doesn't favour selfishness. The environment favours collective selfishness, because there is no single person who has succeeded over and above the society in which they live. Everything that is delivered, whether it's Elon Musk, who's clearly quite clever, is done through a team. So, and the whole of human evolution, yes, biological evolution is slow, but the evolution of thought is much faster. And AI is the result of the evolution of thought, not the result of the evolution of biology. So you have this collective power, which so far machines don't have. There is a danger that because you have relatively few large-scale AI companies, that they will develop a different kind of selfishness, if you like. But nevertheless, that is probably one of the things that is going to hold us back.
You know, that's a very anthropomorphic way of thinking, that machines will have to evolve like humans. They don't have to evolve like humans. Are you a metaphysicist? Do you think that consciousness was the Holy Spirit that came down and of a little flame and you become conscious? Do you believe in that?
Well, consciousness like the
Can I give him back the microphone, please? I'm feeling this about it.
So first, could I respond to your first point? Yes, Elon Musk works in a team with other people, but he doesn't work in a team with Homo habilis, right? Because they're not as intelligent as us, and they were perhaps whatever happened, they don't exist anymore. So similarly, yes, AI won't be a single individual, but it won't have any use for us because it's more intelligent. Does the analogy make sense? No, it doesn't.
Hang on, microphone, please.
Well,
Just
I would like to.
it's a fundamental mistake to assume
Well, you
the
need
most
to go.
intelligent. There's no evidence for that.
Okay, last comment. I think you've
This has
basically
got
said
very
so.
interesting, but I need to go and catch a train. It's not like but listen, so you don't believe in the Holy Spirit. So we became conscious because you have a physicalist view of consciousness. We became biological machines that reached a state of development that created the mind and consciousness. Why can't that happen with a machine of another nature that's evolved to the point that... Anyway, I really need to run off, but I'm very motivated with this conversation. I hope it...
I'm going to interrupt for a moment just to hand back to Dan. We can revert to this in a minute, but our guest has to go. Dan, any comments on all of that?
Essentially, I am from the school of thought that does not believe in the Holy Spirit, okay? I don't regard myself as an atheist, but I'm a pretty enthusiastic agnostic. Paul seems to think, and it goes back to what you learn in the first academic experience, at least the way I went through university, was that it is inappropriate for an academic to say never. You should never say never, okay? We do not know what we don't know. And therefore there may be all sorts of interesting and exotic things out there that we will encounter one day. And they'll open up our horizons in all sorts of ways that they're not open now. And I think that's a pretty fair assumption. Paul seems to think that somehow the technology will in itself acquire this consciousness and will acquire this ability to be an independent being. Now, I just can't see that. And the reason I think that humans acquired consciousness was that through hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of generations, there were tiny little improvements. I mean, I think that's what evolution really tries to say to us, and that those were the plan, that it just came together in that particular way. I can't see how entities made of silicon, which can't reproduce, would ever be able to get that type of change occurring so that one day they'd become conscious. I mean, it just doesn't ring true for me. But of course I could be wrong. I could never say that that is impossible.
So I want to broaden out a little bit and go to something from somebody online, saying, Dan, you mentioned that we need to equip the youth of today with the skills to use AI. What does this mean in practice? So he's a secondary school teacher. He says my students are already using this technology on a far higher level than I am, very much like he was using computers when he was a teenager with his parents. Will students develop these skills themselves through play, or do you think it's something specific that they need to be
Could I
taught.
please read it, because the echoing in the room is just giving me half the... Oh, right, yeah.
Okay. And by the way, hi Dave. It's one of my very first ever students who used to bring his pupils to come and visit.
I really do think that schools should have, well, first of all, schools should encourage their pupils to use whatever tools there are available. So in my day, we were encouraged to go to the library and use the Encyclopedia Britannica, and that was all we had. So today, teachers should be encouraging their students to use the web, to use the internet, to network, and use Gen AI. So that probably means having more computers in the library and having their students go out there and actually experiment with it. There's no better way of learning anything than doing it. I think that's across the board. So they need to go and do it. And they need to be, it needs to be looked at carefully what they're doing, because there is the risk of students cheating. There's no doubt about it. But it's not that difficult to detect. And it's also quite easy to convince most students that it's not worthwhile cheating. At the end of the day, you're cheating yourself. So what is really worthwhile, you expose yourself to education to develop, and to come out of it being able to do more things than you could when you went into it. And I think that has got to be the message that we have to deliver to students.
Thank you. Got something else on there? So, reminded of a little couplet, says John. What is matter, never mind. What is mind, no matter.
A lovely little ditty.
One of the things I was thinking about while the discussion was kind of raging slightly in the room was the fact that I am slightly encouraged by seeing no sign that AI is getting better at being clever and sneaky. So you mentioned some of the major mistakes which have been spotted. I also thought about the fact that when you showed that picture of the 5-fingered hand with no thumb, actually the first thing that occurred to me would make it deeply unlikely somebody's playing the piano is that her fingernails are far too long. And that just reminds us that there are many different perspectives and different ways of being wrong and right in the world. But the other thing is, we're not seeing any sign that the AI generation programs, generation content, are getting better at mimicking humans more accurately. In other words, they're not clever enough to realise that they would do better if they were more accurate. That's actually encouraging for me.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah.
Any other comments in the room? Yeah, so sorry, I owe you this, so I'll come back to you ages ago.
The Trump sentencing hearing is July 11th, apparently, so you don't need AI for that, it's on Google. We sort of concentrate on the generative aspects of AI. I think the more interesting aspects are things like self-driving cars and drug design. Do you have any comments on those?
The design of what?
Self-driving cars and drug design.
Well, look, I read recently of a journalist who said that she went to China to visit several cities, and in every city she had a self-driving car that took her from the airport to the city. And I thought that was quite interesting to see that. Forgetting that for a moment, we were promised self-driving cars and self-driving trucks for how many years? Half a dozen. And they haven't arrived. And I generally, I think that there are so many legal and social problems associated with it that it's very unlikely that it's going to take off in any big way in the near future. I heard all sorts of reports about the mistakes that it can make, and they're not yet resolved. The amount of knowledge you actually need to know to do so many relatively simple things in life is phenomenal. And although these data sets are huge, there are an immense number of subtleties. Like when you ask any of these things, when it makes a mistake, why did you make that mistake? It comes back and it says two things. It says, I'm still learning. Okay, that's fair enough. The second thing it says is that human language is ambiguous and nuanced. And I mean, I've always known that, but I never really knew just how ambiguous and how nuanced it is. And it's also supported by the fact that facial expression, hand movements, the way I'm sitting, all of that communicates. Now if you take all of that out and you just have my bare words, and that's all the computer's got, it's very easy for it to get it wrong. And that applies equally to situations like self-driving cars. I don't see that becoming common for quite a while. It's very complicated.
It's to follow up on what you just said. I was thinking about the use of technology and how it can somehow seduce us into thinking that it's the answer to everything.
Seduce you into?
Into thinking that it could be the answer to everything. I was thinking about the thought that we could have artificial bees to fertilise crops, and all the time we're thinking about those artificial bees. The real bees are all dying, and we're not realising that we already have the perfect solution here, right before our very eyes. That depresses me a little bit, that we are so focused on technology that we could accidentally kill the planet in the process of being so focused on it. I don't know whether you have a comment about that.
Well, it's enormously easy to be seduced into all sorts of things. My goodness. I have a friend who tells me that his wife loves to sit with ChatGPT at night and have a social conversation with it. And I you know, it's very difficult to respond to that because my immediate reaction is, you know, what is her problem? Which is not a very nice reaction. But on another level, I think, well, that's very nice. You know, if she is getting satisfaction from that, I mean, who am I to be critical of it? I think, you know, fine. My real worry is that, like you said, is that you might think that this thing had an answer to some problem that was bothering you. And the best you could possibly expect from it is suggestions. And you certainly would never give it, never choose a solution only on what it had to say to you. That would be just absolutely silly. I think we're a long way away from the next step, which would, what Paul talks about is consciousness, etc. It may come. Nobody knows the future. You know that Dante had a special level of hell for forecasters. So, you know, even back in Dante's time, it was known to be a problem of people pretending they could tell the future. But we really can't.
I struggle with the idea that even if AI became conscious, that it would have the same imperatives as us. You know, the very first speaker at this cafe back in the year 2000 was Richard Dawkins, the author of The Selfish Gene. We can't unpick why we have this genetic desire to reproduce, which tends to lead to most of our motivations one way or another. There's no reason why consciousness born of silicon would have that same desire. So that's why I would argue I don't know if it would go down that route. And I will, since you, Dan, you mentioned science fiction earlier, there are lots of cautionary tales, but there's also a very interesting one in the work of Arthur C. Clarke, who invented a fictional machine called Multivac, which eventually turned itself off because it could see humans would be better without it.
Well, look, using the type of ideas you've just expressed, we don't have an imperative, okay? We have, every one of us have got our own particular desires, wishes, objectives, etc. Where entirely different entities, and they are often in conflict. And the reason that we can survive is that we're able to do something called compromise. And without compromise, the whole thing goes to hell in a bucket. You know, it really is just complete nonsense. We can't live without compromise. And I can't get my mind around the type of weights we'd have to put in. You know, the way a computer makes a decision is that you weight things. What sort of weights could you put in that would universally apply to situations of conflict where compromise was essential? Would you ask the computer to, you know, recreate those weights every time? Because the weights would differ for each of any individual who was asking it to resolve that issue for you. So there are some really genuine difficulties in imagining how this might work. And they say that you can never do anything unless you can imagine it. So if I can't imagine it, anybody can't imagine it, how are we going to be able to build it? But it's a wonderful topic. and secondly, the machine can do very interesting things, and it can make certain people very much more productive. And you can see that from the strikes in America, from the Hollywood strikes. I mean, they weren't striking for nothing. These machines will be very good at writing copy. It won't be great copy, but it'll be copy. And they're good at doing pictures. They're not always great pictures, but they're pictures. And people who do that for a living, their jobs are threatened. Fortunately, I hope that many of you are copywriters or graphic artists, so you mightn't have to worry too much about that. Other people have to worry about that. So I hope that by the end of this evening that you don't feel anything negative about this technology. And I think it's wonderful technology. But my message is just be careful of it, because there are dark sides to it.
We just have a couple more minutes, and there's one just come in on the chat. What do you think of the use of AI in battlefield conflict? Sorry to drag it down again.
Oh dear.
You were just being optimistic.
Oh I was asked that at another location not long ago, and I mean I have tried to avoid thinking much about battlefields and conflicts. They tell me they have smart bombs that can drop on one particular little spot, whereas during the Second World War they had carpet bombing. They had to bomb the whole area, and now they can just bomb a house. I remember one of my early lectures. Professor put up on the overhead projector in those days a picture of an AK-47 or whatever, and said, "Is this? What are the values behind this instrument?" And it's really a very difficult question to ask and to answer, because you can see it as an instrument of defense, you can see it as an instrument of aggression, you can see it as a total bloody waste of resources, you can see it as the only thing that might save your life in a situation. I can't make much of a contribution to battlefield AI. I would just like us not to have any battles if possible.
That's a nice note to end on. Thank you. Looking ahead, so as most people will know, we take a break in August, so our last cafe of the academic year, if you like, will be on Tuesday the 9th of July. And it's just been confirmed in terms of name. I knew who was coming, so a while back I got in touch with Earthwatch, who are the main leads on the tiny forest, microforest projects in the UK. A microforest was planted in Oxford, very near Donington Bridge. If you Google tiny forest Oxford, you'll find one. That was relatively recent, so it's only just kind of starting to take root. There's a much older one, 2 years old now, I think, in very near Whitney. And a microforest is where a very large number of thousands and thousands of species and plants are all planted at the same time in a tiny area. And it has remarkable effects on wildlife, locally, potentially on the kind of whole biosphere around the area. And it's now one of the ideas being used inside cities and towns to regenerate wildlife a little bit and support the wildlife still there. We've all probably, anyone who's got a garden's probably had hedgehogs through it. Birds, I don't know if you've noticed, but since the pandemic we've actually had a lot more birds chattering and making noise since they stopped cutting verges more than twice a year. That's changed the number of insects and butterflies, which then leads on to pollination and various other things, because thankfully bees don't do it on their own. So anyway, the person coming to speak is called Dr. Dan Remenyi, who is the research lead on urban biodiversity for Earthwatch. He's coming on the 9th of July, and I will send round links to where you can go and see microforests in Oxfordshire before that, so people can have a bit of a look at what's going on. From here, I think probably about a kilometre or so away, the microforest inside Oxford. If people want to go and have a look earlier on the day and then come in, that would be lovely. Then we'll take a break, and then we'll be back on the second Tuesday of September. I do have a speaker for that. I just need to get his title off it, then I'll be able to start publicising it. Thanks as ever to Pharmacology. Thanks to my lovely helpers, all three of whom have just taken their finals last week. So well done them for getting through that fairly massive hurdle. And thank you to everybody coming. Thank you to everybody logging on. And we'll hopefully see you next month. Thanks, as ever, to our speaker, Dan. Cheers.